Hi everyone, back again so soon with another video. This video is actually kind of a response to the last video, that's why. But it's not a response to myself, it's a response to some of the comments in the last video. And so before you watch this video, you might want to watch that last video that was about being non-binary but not trans, because that might provide some much needed context for this video. Anyway, there were some people in the comments on that last video who commented on how it seems like there's a binary between cis and trans identities, almost like the male-female gender binary. And yeah, that's something that I didn't talk about in my last video, but it is something that I have talked about before. I know that I at least have a post on Tumblr dated 2014 where I kind of ranted about that, but I haven't mentioned it at all on YouTube, or not directly. And I haven't talked about it much directly on Tumblr either, so let's talk about that today. I'm also going to be posting a text version of this video on Tumblr, so if you don't feel like watching this video but you are inclined to reading, maybe check out the link in the video description. So yeah, let's talk about gender again. Let's talk about how you may or may not know, but since you're watching this YouTube channel, you probably do know that there is a false binary, false dichotomy, the male-female binary surrounding gender, and how that fucks over any racist non-binary people. Good, we're on the same page, right? So now let's talk about how that isn't even the only binary that exists surrounding gender and identity. Let's talk about how even if a non-binary person manages to navigate the male-female binary within society and live openly as a non-binary person, they are then faced with yet another binary, another dichotomy within the very communities that they're supposed to be at least a little bit safer in compared to the rest of society. Let's talk about how within the LGBT, QIA, etc. community, there are, for example, surveys, questionnaires, registration forms, etc. that expect you to choose between the options cis or trans, and that refer to transition as trans status. Let's talk about activism that contrasts trans people with cis allies without mention of non-binary people or anyone else, because there's the assumption that, well, if you aren't cis, that means you automatically count and identify as trans, or else you're basically just cis. Let's talk about medical professionals and even your average LGBT and yes, even T people who will qualify a person's gender, binary or not, by holding it up to a binary trans narrative and deciding, you have to meet this level that they decide of whatever to be trans, or else you're just cis, and if you don't explicitly identify as trans, well then that's just proof that you're just cis. Let's talk about activism that promotes itself as being inclusive of trans, non-binary, and gender diverse people, but then only advocates for trans rights under the assumption that trans rights automatically encompasses the needs and rights of non-binary and gender diverse people, even though it doesn't always. And those are just some examples of the ways in which another binary, another gender binary, is being upheld within the LGBTQIA community. But wait, let's not stop there. Let's even talk about how even in the most gender diverse spaces, the male-female gender binary is literally often just swapped out for a trans-cis binary. If you aren't male, then you're female. Oh wait, no, I meant if you aren't cis, then you're trans. If you aren't female, then you're male. Oh wait, no, I meant if you aren't trans, then you're cis. You're either male or you're female. Oh wait, no, I meant you're either cis or you're trans. There are only two genders, male and female. Wait, no, I meant there are only two ways in which you can relate to your assigned gender at birth, either by identifying as it, i.e. being cis, or by not identifying as it, i.e. being trans. Does that sound familiar? Let's talk about how inclusive definitions of trans are really great. For example, defining trans as someone whose gender or sex differs from the gender or sex they were assigned at birth. I think that's a great definition. I totally support it. But let's also talk about how definitions do not automatically translate into identities. Let's talk about how there's a lot more attached to and involved with an identity than there is with a simple definition, and how a definition or a word being accurate to describe someone does not automatically mean that it's comfortable as an identity. Let's talk about how inclusive definitions do not translate into obligatory identities. Let's talk about how no one is ever obligated to identify as anything, and how even if a word theoretically fits a person, that does not mean they're obligated to identify with it. Let's talk about how a non-binary person can just identify as non-binary. Let's talk about how an agender or a genderless person can just identify as agender or genderless without also identifying as trans or even non-binary. Let's talk about how an assigned male at birth, AMAB person, can identify as a woman without identifying as a trans woman. And let's talk about how an assigned female at birth, AFAB person, can identify as a woman without identifying as a cis woman. That's right, a woman can just identify as a woman. There does not have to be the prefix cis or trans in front of that. And if you went out on the street and asked a random woman how she identifies, or rather what her gender is, she would just tell you that she's a woman. And yet, let's talk about how trans women are for some reason expected to explicitly identify as trans women in addition to identifying as a woman. And let's see if you can do that without going into respectability politics, because you probably can't, because literally that is the only thing that holds trans women to a different level of expectation than cis women, in that they are expected to forever identify as trans women. Let's also talk about how not only can a person explicitly not identify as something, a person may identify as something but not in an active way. They may identify with a word but not actually introduce themselves using that word. They may not refer to themselves using that word, even if the identity is still there. And while we're at it, since we've already come this far and you've seen my lighting change in a million different ways, as if I'm recording this at all kinds of different times a day, but really I'm just continually word vomiting at you, let's also talk about how someone can not identify as anything, explicitly or otherwise. And let's also talk about how someone could be questioning and how hurtful or even damaging it can be for people to expect that person to choose a side in the trans cis binary, and how that expectation comes from all sides, be it cis, trans, non-binary, or otherwise. Oh wait, and this is a big one, especially for me personally. Let's talk about how not everyone can, should, or even has to identify in a way that juxtaposes their gender with the gender that some random doctor wrote on a certificate a million years ago. Let's talk about how not everyone wants to or should even be expected to reference their assigned gender at birth in any way whatsoever, be it even to say whether they identify with it or not. And let's talk about how cis and trans as words, that's literally all they do is reference your assigned gender at birth and how you identify or disidentify with it. So yes, by all means, let's talk about how to use language that is more inclusive of trans people, because that is really, really fucking important. I am all here for that. But let's also bear in mind that inclusive language for trans people does not automatically translate into inclusivity of everyone, because there are more than just trans and cis people. Not everyone is or identifies as cis or trans. And so your language, how we talk about things, really needs to be generally inclusive, not just revolving around the word trans or cis. Let's not leave people who do not identify as cis or trans out of the conversation, and let's certainly not throw them under the proverbial bus, because it's easier for you to operate in the mindset of everyone being either cis or trans. Because yes, that's why society operates in binaries and dichotomies, because they are simpler. But the world in actuality is not black and white. The world in actuality is not straight or gay. The world in actuality is not cis or trans. There is more to it than that. Let's talk about how we can diversify our language and how sometimes it is not the best course of action to just rely on umbrella terms, assuming that everyone falls under at least one of them, because yeah, that may be true, but it also may not be true. And let's also talk about how it can be so validating and so empowering to explicitly name who you're talking about, who you're advocating for, who you're referencing. And yes, I know, I've realized that you cannot always explicitly name everyone. There are just too many people, and you risk leaving out people if you try to be totally explicit. I understand that, but let's also realize that umbrella terms also have pitfalls, and they are not automatically encompassing of everyone. And I know this has turned into a long video, but the most important thing that I am here to say is just let's talk. Let's talk as a community. Let's talk together. Because I sure as hell am just one person expressing my thoughts and my feelings and my experiences here on the internet, and talking directly to me is probably not going to actually change anything. But if we talk to each other, if we start a conversation, maybe things will change. And that's all this video is trying to do, is start a conversation. Not specifically with me, but within the community at large. Let's talk to each other. Let's just talk. If you've made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for putting up with everything. Thank you so much for putting up with all the traffic noise, the changing lighting, which is really just clouds passing over the fucking sun because it's a cloudy day. Thank you for putting up with the traffic noise, because you have no idea how many times I've had to stop and start recording this video, and literally every video that I make, honestly, because my fucking apartment is just so that all the time. But anyways, thank you for watching. I appreciate it so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.